So let me say a word about our speaker, and then I will turn it over to our wonderful interviewers. Max Lerner was born in 1924 in Vienna, Austria. After he was expelled from school by the Nazis, the family fled to Paris. After 3 years of challenges, they secured visas to the United States, and in April 1941, they arrived safely in New York City. At 18, Max enlisted in the US Army, knowing he would eventually be drafted. He was eager to be involved in the war. Because of his language skills, he was assigned to the Military Intelligence Training Center at Camp Ritchie in Maryland. Almost a year after volunteering for service, Max became an American citizen, which he says was the proudest day of his life. He went back to Europe as an American soldier in March 1944 and was recruited into the Office of Strategic Services and served as a special agent in the Counterintelligence Corps while still engaging in secret missions for the OSS. After Germany's surrender, Max was involved in the short-lived denazification effort in Europe. Today, Max is an author and a member of the Speakers Bureau of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. And we're so honored to have him with us and to interview him. We're privileged to have two members of our Tasty Senior Youth Group Board, Andrew Feller and Hannah Freeberg. I'm going to turn it over to Andrew and Hannah to offer some questions. If you have questions that you'd like to ask Max, we may have a few minutes at the end, and I'd encourage you to write your questions in the chat box. So I'm going to turn it over to Andrew and Hannah, who will take it from here.
Okay, hello everybody. Try to listen as we talk over the check outside, right on point. So our first question for Max is just about your background, your roots. Is where did you grow up, and did you have any siblings, or do you still have any siblings?
Max, if you want to unmute yourself.
I had a lot of trouble hearing this. This was not clear.
We can hear you. Did you hear Andrew's question?
It was not well done. It was not clear. I
Okay.
have to answer the question, but you have to ask it again. It was disrupted.
No problem. So yes, so just starting about your background and roots is question is where did you grow up, and did you or do you still have any siblings?
I grew up in Vienna, Austria, where I was born in 1924, an unimaginable time from now. I had a sister who was 4 years younger than me, and my parents and my sister and I lived a normal upper middle class life in Vienna. And then the Nazis took over Austria, and the 7.5 million Austrians enjoyed it very much, except for the 180,000 Jews that lived in Austria. My sister is no longer with us, but she left me 3 wonderful nephews that I'm very close with. Next question.
So before you came to the US, where in Europe were you living? I know you traveled around Europe a little bit after you left Vienna.
We had a lot of trouble. First, when I was expelled, when our Jews were expelled from my school, the first thing we had to do was to clean the sidewalk that we had polluted for all these years. We were given toothbrushes and we had to clean the sidewalk. That was our introduction to the German Reich. We got out to Paris, and in 1940, Germany defeated France and entered Paris, and we left Paris for a 6-week odyssey trying to get out of France. We tried to get into Spain, but Franco, who was the dictator of Spain, was an ally of Hitler and didn't let us get in there. After 6 weeks on the road, sleeping in haystacks, in barns, in one place in Pau, we slept in a school. There were thousands and thousands and thousands of refugees coming down from Paris. Then France surrendered, and there was a division. Northern France was occupied by the Germans, and the section of southern France was occupied, or was supposedly free under a collaboratist regime called the Vichy regime for its headquarters in Vichy, France. They were as bad as the Germans. We wound up after that 6 weeks odyssey in Nice, and we did not know what to do. To be a Jew in German-occupied Europe at that time was incredibly dangerous, and there was no way out. The only port from which one could escape was Lisbon, Portugal. But we were blocked from getting to Lisbon because Spain wouldn't accept our documents. In Nice, we checked with the American consulate. The United States was not yet in the war, and we got our American visa after waiting for it for 3 years, in a very complicated manner. And then getting to Lisbon, the only place where there was a ship, was a major challenge, which we overcame. I have no time to tell you about it. And from Lisbon, we managed to get on a ship in Nyassa and arrived in New York April 25th, 1941, on a Friday.
So next, could you tell us more about when you were actually forced to leave your home? Like, how old were you and who else was with you?
I was 13 and a half, and my parents and my younger sister and we were always traveling together. We did not separate until we came to the United States.
And what was that process like getting to the United States?
I just told you the difficulty was enormous. The paperwork required was incredible. It took effort, bribery, faking things. We broke any number of Nazi laws, but we made it.
Next question. So once you got to the US, what did you do once you arrived here, and what was the transition like into American life?
Well, there is a good question. When we arrived in the United States, I did not speak English. I could read English. I had taught myself to read English by reading English books, but I couldn't speak it. We had no money at all. My father got a loan from the HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Society, and we never went to a movie until that loan was repaid. And he could go back in a small way into his business, which was a fur business. I had my first job. I made $8 a week, but the dollar was worth something. And I couldn't speak English, so I wasn't worth much. And I went to school at the New York Evening High School, which stood where Lincoln Center now is.
You joined the Army when you were 18.
Yes.
Why did you decide to go back to Europe?
I was anxious as can be to get into the war. I wanted to get my own back. And after being under Nazi domination for 3 years, it was incredibly important to me. So on my birthday, on my 18th birthday, I signed up. My parents were not happy about it. They knew that eventually I would have to go, but what was a rush? They didn't want to have me hurt, but I wanted to get into it. By the time I had been in the United States for 1.5 years, and I spoke English. Not as well as I could, but adequately. I went into the army. I was called up, went to several camps where I was tested, and then eventually wound up at the Military Intelligence Training Center in Cambridge, Maryland, where I was trained for over 9 months in various intelligence disciplines, interrogation of prisoners of war, for instance, military intelligence interpreter, because I speak French as well as German. Then I went overseas as an American soldier, landed in Northern Ireland in a replacement depot, where I was recruited by the OSS, the predecessor to the CIA, and joined them, and eventually went over to France after D-Day. I didn't participate in D-Day, but I participated in the rest of the conquest, or reconquest, or liberation, if you will, of Europe from German domination. I got to Paris on August 25th with the first troops that entered and liberated Paris. That was an experience. I crossed the Rhine in a boat into German territory. I was involved in the Battle of the Bulge, which was the only time I actually had to fire my gun. And then I got to Dachau, the concentration camp at Dachau, 2 days after liberation, which was the most horrible experience of my life.
What do you think it's important for young people to know as we remember the Holocaust, as there's not many survivors left?
What is important is to understand that it wasn't only the Nazis, that it was all of Germany. Hitler was elected legally with a majority of the votes of German parliament. And he didn't lie, he planned. If you read his book, Mein Kampf, you knew exactly what he wanted to do, and he did it. So all of Germany is responsible for the rise and actions of Hitler. I'll let you quote, I always like to quote one statement. For evil to exist, it is only necessary that good men do nothing. Keep that in mind. Don't be one who does nothing. When there is evil in the world, you have an obligation to stand up against it. I wish that the Germans, who are a cultured people, had remembered that.
So after fighting in the war, what was it like coming back to the US after that and starting your life again?
Well, my life hadn't really started before I went into the army. When I came back, by that time I spoke good English, accented, but as well as I speak it now. When I came back, I got a variety of jobs, and I went to school at night, first to finish a college degree and then to get a master's degree from Columbia, because the GI Bill of Rights paid for it. I had a series of jobs. I got married, I had children, I made some money, and I can afford to live on the Upper East Side. That's the story of my life.
Thank you. There's some questions in the chat box now that some people have asked.
All right.
Someone asked, how could you join the army without being a citizen?
A very good question. And the point was, at that time, you could not fight and go overseas if you weren't a citizen. The result was that I joined the army, and while I was in Camp Ritchie, I became a citizen. And it was 2.5 years after I had arrived in the United States. And it was a wonderful experience for me to put up my hand and swear allegiance to the United States. After all, I did not have a country from the moment that Germany occupied Austria. And it was only after I became a citizen that I would be allowed to fight and go overseas and fight.
Okay, so another question from the chat is, what was your feeling when you were interrogating other Nazi soldiers, and did they know that you were Jewish?
That depended on how quickly I needed information from them. If I had time, I tried to make a point of it. But when I needed information urgently, then I used whatever technique was possible. Being nice, being not so nice. After the war was over, during the 6 months I spent in the town of Wiesbaden in Germany, I was head of the police department, the German police department, and I used them to look for Nazis. The SHAEF, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, had issued a booklet listing Nazi ranks in the various paramilitary organizations as which ones were subject to immediate arrest, including, of course, all members of the SS. You know, the SS was a special paramilitary force that included the Gestapo and the concentration camp guards and the various other organizations that killed Jews.
Was there any discrimination against Jews within the army, the American army?
I did not experience any. And in Camp Ritchie, of course, many of my fellow students were Jewish refugees from Germany or Austria or other parts of the former of Europe.
Tell me, gave the K rations away because
So you were forced to leave your home at 13 and a half, like you said. But do you know when exactly your family knew that they were in danger still living in Austria?
I have an uncle and an aunt living in Vienna. She escaped. He was killed in Auschwitz. I had other relatives living in what was then Czechoslovakia, but is today the Czech Republic, who had various experiences and died. And I had an uncle who, with his son and wife, managed to go illegally to Palestine, British-dominated Palestine, where they became legal only after the establishment of the state in 1948.
After seeing so much horror and destruction in Europe, how did you remain positive throughout the whole experience fighting in the war?
My joy was that we won, that we got our own back. One of my favorite photographs is Munich was the center of the Nazi party. They called it the capital of the Nazi movement. And they had built a tremendous edifice called the Brown House, which was the headquarters and center for the Nazi party. And it took me 2 hours to find the ruins of the Brown House. And when I was in Munich shortly before the end of the war, and I found, and I have a photograph of me standing on the ruins of the Brown House. That gave me a lot of satisfaction.
About how many Nazis re-entered into German society after the war, and how did you actually go about?
I'm sorry, your question didn't come across. Could you repeat it?
Sorry, yeah, of course. About how many Nazis re-entered into German society after the war, and how did you actually go about finding them?
Well, to find them was not difficult. To begin with, any SS member has a blood-type tattoo on his left armpit, and if you let them take off their shirt, you can see either the tattoo or an attempt to eradicate it. that took care of the SS. And if you go to a beach somewhere and see an old geezer who's got a tattoo under his left arm, kick him.
For you.
For me. Other members were.
How do you feel about the rise of anti-Semitism today in the U.S.?
It's unfortunate, but not unexpected. Anti-Semitism, it seems to me, is a disease that will last as long as humanity lasts. Fortunately, we are a stubborn people, and they're not going to get away with getting rid of us.
So how did all of these experiences impact your relationship with Judaism, if it did at all?
I was always proud to be a Jew. I was brought up Orthodox because that's all there was in Vienna at that time. And now I am very happy to be a Reformed Jew. My thinking of that has evolved over the years. I used to be Orthodox, then I was a conservative for a long time. And now I'm happily Charité Fieber Reform.
Thank you so much for answering all these questions. I think there's one more question. What stood out when you were seeing the concentration camps, like people being liberated in the concentration camps at the end of the war?
I got to Dachau 2 days after it was liberated. Dachau was not an extermination camp. Dachau is in a beautiful suburb of Munich, and it was a labor camp where people were starved and killed nevertheless. When I got there were still starving inmates and some who had died because they ate too quickly when our troops gave them food. There were bodies still lying around, and there was an incredible smell, and all these poor people. It was the worst experience I had to come in and yet see American troops taking care of and ministering to the survivors. But the smell and the sight of the bodies lying around will always stay with me.
So after that experience and obviously many others, how do you feel about Germans in Germany today?
That's a very difficult question because instinctively I should hate them, but they are now the third generation and they are not responsible for what their grandparents and great-grandparents did. And Germany has made a major effort to pay back. Well, not that you can pay back for one life. There is no money for that. But Germany has made a major effort to support Israel and to make up to some extent for what they have done. And they have recognized their guilt.
Thank you so much for answering all these
Thank you.
questions.
We're so grateful, Max, to you, and grateful to Hannah and Andrew for speaking with you. Your story is so important. What is the title of your book so that we might buy it?
Light and Return. It's
Say it
available.
one more time.
Light and Return.
Light and Return.
That's my autobiography about those days, and it's available on Amazon.
It's a beautiful, go ahead, Matt. Go ahead, Max.
There are 2 other books that are fiction, but that are based on my experiences. You can find them on the Maximilian Lerner on Amazon. This
Good.
is
Max, we're so grateful. Oh, there's Flight and Return. We really appreciate your sharing your story, and we hope that many people will buy Max's book It's making its way up the Amazon list right now. And I want to thank all of you for being here. We're going to bring this evening to a close with one more melody that I'm going to invite Cantor Kipnis to share at this time. But I'm so grateful as he's preparing. I just want to thank Max again. The accolades are coming in the chat box. So Max, I hope you're seeing all of that, all the gratitude that we have for you for sharing your story. And again, to Hannah and Andrew for your loving and courageous interviewing of Max. We appreciate your time and everything that you're doing and the way in which you're modeling for your peers and for those younger than you and for all of us as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Cantor as we bring it to a